All right. So everybody, thanks so much for listening. If you are listening to us for the first time on the YouTube platform, please subscribe, like, share, and also hit the bells. So that makes sure that you get those updates of all the new interviews we have done, rather. I appreciate you guys listening. If you are listening to us on the radio, the Twitter, the Facebook, or Instagram, also appreciate that. And thanks so much. And definitely share that with your friends also if you do hear us on those platforms. And again, thanks so much. Today we have an interview. We're going to be talking about world affairs. We're also going to be talking about a book that was written by Daniel Levin. And the book is Proof of Life. It's 20 days on the hunt for a missing person in the Middle East. So, Mr. Levin, first of all, thanks so much for coming on the program. Really appreciate your time tonight.
Thanks, Rob. It's a pleasure being with you. Let's do first names basis. Makes it easier.
All right. All right. So then we'll move forward with that. Daniel, thanks so much. So, Daniel, can we talk? Let's first get into the book, I should say, because we do have a lot of stuff to cover on the book, but also besides that, we do have some audience questions from the people listening on whatever platform they were listening on, did email me some questions because they know you are obviously huge in the Middle East, being born there and growing up there in general. So we'll dive into that in a little bit, but let's talk about the book first. The book, as far as it talks about, and you can go more in depth about this, it does have you and you're searching for a missing person in Syria. Everybody knows about Syria. That's big in politics, which is the majority of the show. But back in 2014, where this is where we are talking about where people were disappearing. Now, we've heard many stories about the disappearance of journalists and many people in general in the Middle East. Can you bring us back to first what made you write this book and just talk about your journey through the Middle East during this time of 2014 and trying to be a hostage negotiator and try to get this person back?
Well, the first question I know, which I answer in the book, I'll just give a quick answer. I actually wrote this book because of a promise that I made to two young girls, two young Syrian girls at the time, now young women, who had been taken from their village in Syria and sold into sex slavery in the Gulf. And they had helped me in my search for the missing person. And the only thing they asked for in return was that I tell their story. They didn't want to be just a statistic of that war. They ended up actually getting out and starting a new life, and they're very much still in my life today. But I really decided to write that book, and I started to write it right after I met them back in 2014. So that's the first question. Just to give some context here, I had been active in Syria starting 2012 when the war erupted 2011, and really everyone was fighting everyone, and it wasn't clear who'd gain the upper hand. This is before Russia and the Iranians got involved on behalf of the regime, Russia in particular, in 2015. So it wasn't clear at all that the Bashar al-Assad regime would get through this victoriously. And I'm not sure the last chapter has still been written, but at the time, the opposition organized under the Free Syrian Army was backed by the US. John McCain was very much supportive of them, and others too. They were really gaining the upper hand, and even the allies of the regime, such as the Lebanese group Hezbollah, suffered huge losses on the battlefield. So at the time, all the sides to the war had an interest in figuring out whether we could get a mediated solution there and allow everyone to essentially climb down from the tree. And so our foundation got active, is the European foundation that I run, that got active in 2012-13, both mediating and also trying to identify a group of young Syrians from the different sides, from the different power centers, and take them out of the country and try to prepare them and train them for future leadership position when the country would have to be rebuilt. This is now, 8-9 years ago. And that was the background of our activities. And because we were really well networked in Syria, as a result, when there were missing Westerners who went missing, there were Americans, British, Canadians, French, Japanese, journalists, aid workers, all kinds. In some cases, we were contacted by the families or the governments because they couldn't get information on them. And just because of the network that we had from our work there, in some instances, we were able to help. And so this is the background. This is the background to the events that led in 2014, just to frame it a little bit in that context.
No, I appreciate that. So, the book really talks about the dangers of being a hostage negotiator. Can you talk about, first of all, how did you get into that as far as being a hostage negotiator? What are the tools that you use to kind of track someone down?
So
Right.
in some cases, you really don't know who captured a missing person in a war zone. In other cases, you may know, but the group denies it. So, for example, the Syrian regime, when they capture people, they
Mhm.
always deny having them because they know full well that if the person, something happens to them or the person passes away, then they'll be blamed for it. So until they're ready to release, if they're ready to release, they always deny having the person. Whereas some of the terrorists or the Islamist groups, the ISIS or the Nusra rebels, when they have people, they often communicate that they have them because they're trying to negotiate ransom payments or something else. Now, you should also know part of the trickery here is that hostages are traded among the groups. There are many instances of hostages who are captured by one group and traded between groups who might seem like enemies on the battlefield, but actually all doing business together. They trade human beings, they trade young girls, they trade oil, weapons, drugs, food, whatever it is traded in a war. So you definitely, it's not so that you if you don't know something in the first few hours, you don't you're not able to be successful there. My background here wasn't really, I'm a lawyer by background actually, and I didn't get to this by trying to be hostage negotiation. I served in the army in the Middle East, but I wasn't in any context with hostage negotiation. I was in the combat unit. What happened here was that I really just got contacted, usually by desperate parents, in some cases by governments, who for whatever reason couldn't really penetrate in the place. They couldn't get through to the groups that were holding him. And just because we were working with all the sides to the war, I was at least able through a network or sometimes through contacts of contacts to at least get some information, get some proof of life, see whether someone has someone. If they do they want anything in return? What would be the terms? And so listen, that your failure rate, unfortunately, is really high. And most of these cases don't have happy endings. So I don't want it to sound like you fly in there and fly home with a hostage. In most cases, they're awful. And 2014 was a particularly hard year because that's when hostages were decapitated. You had James Foley, Stephen Sotloff. They were on video. It was really a tragic year, and it's in that context, late in that year, that I was asked to help in this case.
But for the viewers that don't know much about politics, can you talk about the Syrian War and how it started in general?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you start, the Syrian war started in 2011. 2011 was when what we call the Arab Spring started. It started
Right.
initially in Tunisia with a fruit vendor getting sick and tired of the corruption and the cops shaking him down for some kickbacks and put himself on fire and killed himself, burning himself to death. And that started huge protests in Tunisia, and that spilled over into other countries. It spilled over into Egypt. It spilled over, obviously, throughout the Middle East. Scared a lot of the autocrats in the region, scared them, because they thought this is just going to topple them, just like it toppled the regime in Tunisia, toppled President Mubarak in Egypt, as an example. And so, same thing happened in Syria, and it actually started in Syria with protests against the bread prices. The government decided to increase wheat and bread prices in the country, and the initial protests were very peaceful. People just said, listen, we're starving here, we have inflation. Don't do that to us while you and your family, meaning the ruling class, are billionaires. Don't do that. But instead of negotiating intelligently, what the president decided to do, he and his family and the regime, is they started to respond extremely violently. They took little children and started to beat them to death in the back of police vans. And so the violent response to these protests, which were really economic protests, is what created then this huge revolution in the country. And that's how the country went down the drain. But let me say another thing, and this would take perhaps too long to get in depth into. There is always some context here. Don't forget, in Syria, the regime in Syria, the Bashar al-Assad regime, is a minority regime. In other words, they're a group called Alawites or Alawis. That's a part of the Shia sect that comes from the coastal region in the west of Syria. They're a small minority in the country. The majority of Syrians are Sunni Muslims. And this is a legacy of the colonial powers, the British and the French, but in particular the British, who perfected this thing that when they would colonize an area, and as they did in the Middle East, the first thing they would do is take a minority group and put them in power, because they knew that this minority group would never be popular in the population, so they would depend on the colonial powers for their protection. And you see this even still today. You see this in Syria. You saw this in Iraq with Saddam Hussein. Iraq was a majority Shia country. So what did the colonial powers do? They put a Sunni group in power in Iraq. So it's the same thing. Put a minority there so they depend. So when you see this lack of popular support in Syria that the regime has to suppress violently, some of it really goes back to colonial days. So there's always some historical context you got to see it, because otherwise you'd say, okay, just have a vote, whoever wins, but they can't allow for that vote because they know that they would be out of power in 3 seconds, and then all the murders of the last 30 years they would be put in court for.
Yeah, I know you said the foundation is really involved in Libya. I remember watching a documentary maybe a couple months back about Libya and the slaves that they were selling this over there. Is it really as extremely bad as, I see in these documentaries as far as slaves over there?
Yeah, I mean, most of these are African migrants who make their way via Chad, usually from Niger, from really poor sub-Saharan African countries who are trying to make their way to Europe. This is actually just a horrific tragedy. And so they make their way, the fastest way to migrate through Libya and then get on these canoes, basically, these boats that can hardly make and try to make their way through the Mediterranean to Italy, right, to Sicily and some of the southern Italian ports. And the problem is that they now get captured by, in many cases, former torturers of the Gaddafi regime. In the east, it's under the guy called Khalifa Haftar, a general who used to be a CIA asset. So it gets really messy, right? They get captured and sold off in slave markets in Libya. So again, this is just part of the byproduct. If you're going to topple Gaddafi, you can't just do that and think it's just going to be Switzerland there afterwards. If you're going to do that, you have to be committed to staying there, help rebuild that country, disarm all those militias so that you can rearm a national army, train them, and maintain that relationship. We and the West, meaning the French, British, and us, did it in the dumbest possible way. We bombed, we allowed to bomb, but we allowed Gaddafi to get deposed, but we then didn't maintain the relationship with the power centers and the tribes on the ground to make sure that we can rebuild a national state. So what you see with the slaves that you talked about, and it's absolutely correct, this does happen, are these tragedies of these African migrants coming from destitute, poor sub-Saharan countries trying to look for a better living in Europe and get caught in Libya before they can mount those boats and then get sold into slavery.
So you talked a lot about the drug trade and with ISIS and how they're really, involved in that. Can you tell the viewers a little bit about that? I think it's
Sure.
Captagon and over there. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a drug called Captagon. Actually, so Captagon is an amphetamine. It's a synthetic amphetamine. It's not only extremely dangerous, it's also really easy and cheap to make. Any kid in high school with a scale and a cheap chemistry lab can produce it. And it's being mass produced out of Syria and sold, and it's created massive addictions all over the world, mainly the Gulf. Huge amounts of Saudi young males are addicted to it. It creates high toxicity in the blood and in the heart, so people are dying from it. And it's being sold very often in little blister packs to make it look like it's ADHD medication. It's making its way into southern France and Britain. Italy just had a haul worth $10 billion of Captagon pills, market value, that they just caught. Now, step back. Captagon's not a new drug. Captagon was developed in the 60s in Germany, and it was actually done as to deal with the sleep apnea and other issues, and then it was pulled out. It was basically outlawed by medical associations about 10, 15 years later because of all the side effects that it had. But the fact that amphetamines are developed in wars is nothing new. First of all, it's done for two reasons. One is fuels the fighters, because fighters just get into this amphetamine craze, and that's nothing new. And it keeps the war economy alive. I mean, the profits from these wars are astronomical. And it's not just the guys making it or trading it. It's also the banks that take the cash and put it into the system so they can then do SWIFTs. And these are Western banks participating. And I want to remind you something. In the Second World War, the German troops, Hitler's troops, they used an amphetamine very similar called Pervitin. And that was the amphetamine that was used to allow the German troops to travel for 4 or 5 days and fight 4 or 5 days without sleep, with the so-called Blitzkrieg to Western Europe. They were really just basically on a crazed high from that amphetamine at the time. Hitler himself is said to have had an addiction to it. So the idea of these kinds of synthetic amphetamines being used and developed in war is nothing new. But Captagon has ravaged this war and has really created the kinds of profits that provide an incentive for the warlords to keep this war going. because of course, when the fighting stops, their life becomes much harder.
It's crazy. I've heard those stories too, like that they take these pills and it keeps them awake, for days upon end. And now you're telling me that that stuff is actually factually true. So
And it's
it,
also, but it's also being used as a party drug in Dubai and in Saudi, in Riyadh, So, I mean, it's all kinds of usages from ISIS fighters and regime fighters. And it's, by the way, being manufactured and traded, not just from ISIS and Islamist fighters, but also from the militias that fight for the regime. So literally every single warlord in Syria has his fingers in this drug trade. And in my story, in the book that I tell, the guy that I need to track down, because I know that he has information on the missing person I'm looking for, because at some point his guys had captured him, is the biggest Captagon warlord in Syria. And I actually have to chase him, and I chase him through the Middle East from Jordan all the way to Dubai, where I finally catch up with this guy.
Has your opinions changed on war? Because, even growing up as a millennial, I believe 9/11 happened. I was in, I don't know, sixth or seventh grade, and everybody was rah, rah America. And then obviously the Iraq War and then all the other wars after that. My opinions really changed, even though I haven't even been to those war-torn areas like you have. So how has your opinion changed since, being born in this part of the world, but also now working against people that are kidnapping people, that are doing sex trades? You see all this stuff, like you said, in Libya, where there's guys and women in cages being sold as slaves. How has all that stuff changed you?
Syria is real different. So, I was born in Israel. I served in the Israeli army. I experienced combat in all the countries in that region. And so war is never a good thing. If you're going to go into war in a combat role, you have to be prepared for two things. You have to be prepared to kill, and you have to be prepared to get killed. And that's just the reality of war. And I think that if people don't experience it, don't quite comprehend what that means. I don't mean to sound trivial about words like life and death, but it's really just a completely different kind of existence. And the rules of social behavior that you thought worked just don't work. Syria and this particular conflict is real different. I mean, I've been out to Syria several times, and I'd seen Syria before the war, and cultures. Don't forget, Syria. Some of the civilizations in Syria go back 2,500 years. You have ruins that predate Roman times. They're the most unbelievable places in Aleppo in the north, in Raqqa in the west, in Palmyra. They're all destroyed. Those are all ruins now. So it's not just obviously the terrible human toll with hundreds of thousands of deaths and millions of displaced people. I mean, the whole population, this country is a broken country. But what I saw in Syria that I didn't experience even in Libya, not in Iraq, and even in Yemen where I've been, what I saw in Syria is kind of a devastation where I don't see how in my lifetime or in your lifetime we're going to experience anything close to a functioning country there. It's just it's so wiped out. And I'm not just talking about the stones where houses used to stand, just a wiped out economy, a wiped out society, the kind of pain and suffering just for the sake of it. You asked me how the war started. Bashar al-Assad, the current president, wasn't supposed to be president. His dad, Hafez al-Assad, was a smart. It was a former Air Force pilot, again from the Alawi sect, so minority, very smart, very ruthless, but understood when to be ruthless and when to have coalitions. He understood that always. Now, his oldest son was supposed to be his successor, a guy called Basel al-Assad. Problem was his oldest son also really liked fast cars, and he had suffered in one of those fast cars. He drove a little bit too fast and had a fatal car accident. So then what do you do, right? That's just in the late 90s. So what do you do? Next son. Now that next son is Bashar al-Assad. He is not leadership material. He's studying in England to become an ophthalmologist. He is very uncharismatic. He has slight speech impediments, so people used to make fun of him. He was bullied a lot for that. And then he becomes president. So what happens with bullies when they get real power? It's payback time. People who are bullied, sorry, I should say. It's payback time. So now the people don't like him. In 2011, you have protests in the streets, but we're talking about children shouting, "We want cheaper bread." We're talking about that. We're not saying, "Assad, we will kill you." We're talking about people saying, "Undo those price increases." And instead of going and negotiating, he does what every insecure man does. He just lashes out. He starts to grab these kids, beats them to death, grabs women, beats them to death, grabs men, beats them to death, tortures them, rapes, everything. And so at some point, the people say, okay, if that's what it's going to be, I guess then we're going to fight you. And 10 years ago, he says, okay, you guys have a choice. You either get me, Assad, or I burn the country to the ground. And now what happens is they get both. So the violence in Syria, it wasn't just the kind of Saddam Hussein violence or Gaddafi violence that I saw in the Middle East, or the type of civil war that you see in Yemen, where tribes are trying to figure it out and different groups are trying to fight it out. And it's awful, tragic, and children are dying and diseases breaking out. But you feel like they're doing it for the sake of getting control over that country and ruling an actual country. In Syria, I don't get that sense anymore. In Syria, what you're getting the sense is they're burning the place to the ground, and it's for the sake of showing that no one will out crazy them, no one will out tough them, and it's a dimension of violence that I've never experienced, never, in all the conflict zones that I've been in. There've been many in the Middle East, in Africa, and South America throughout my life. I've never experienced anything like Syria.
So I want to ask you this. So, being critical about, Europe's involvement, America's involvement in the war in Syria, how did you mediate and prepare the country for the post-conflict society, I guess?
Well, what you're doing is the analogy I use for that, and the red line, by the way, Obama's red line 2012 was obviously his biggest foreign policy blunder, as far as I'm concerned. If you have a red line and then a year later you say the red line is if they ever move chemical weapons, let alone use them, that's a red line. And the answer is then they do that and you don't do anything a year later. Now, there are all kinds of conspiracies that it wasn't really the regime. Cy Hirsch wrote a piece about that it wasn't really the regime and they were trying to make it look like the regime. But the answer is every group in Syria has used chemical weapons in the meantime. So that red line has been crossed the whole time, and with all the tragic effects. Saddam Hussein, by the way, used chemical weapons on the Kurds in the north in Iraq, and that's actually what swung the war in his favor, because he basically out-crazied everyone else. He also used chemical weapons against the Iranians. Now, you have to at some point decide, do we have rules of warfare and Geneva Conventions, or don't we have them? But that's a separate chapter. I think that when you ask about the people that we're trying to get out and prepare them for roles post-conflict, think of it this way. If you're a surgeon and you have to perform an operation on someone, you don't wait until you start the surgery before you stick them an infusion, because by then the blood pressure has dropped and you can't find a vein anymore. If you're going to have to do surgery, what they do is they put an infusion in your arm before the surgery, right? Not because they need it before the surgery, but because you want to have it available when the surgery has started, because by then you won't find a vein anymore, right? Same thing here. Obviously, we know full well when you take 20, 30, 50 people out of a country, we're doing that with Libya, we're doing that with Yemen now, you can't put them back into their roles until the killing stops, right? There's no country to rebuild. The problem is when the killing does stop, in whatever context, different in every place, if you don't have those people available, the killing starts right away again. So what we're doing is, right, because everyone's going to say, well, there's no one here, there's no one to work with, there's no group that we could actually run this country with, and then the fighting starts again. So what we do is we take them out, put them in a peaceful place, and start to train them on every aspect of government, on civilian government, on military government. How do you run a place? How do you run a Ministry of Finance? How do you manage your finances of the country? How do you build a school system? How do you build a hospital system, a healthcare system? There's a real know-how that has to go into it. These are not just desert kingdoms. These are, they all have internet, they all have Wi-Fi, they all have iPhones. We're in a much more interconnected world today. The gaps between us and other parts of the world are not as big as we think. This isn't the Stone Age in North Korea here now. And so they want functioning government, and usually these countries fall apart when you don't have functioning government. We talk, for example, we teach them about new forms of government that don't become this zero-sum game where the winner gets everything and everyone else loses, right? We talk about rotation governments where members of different tribes rotate in different ministries so that everyone shares in some form. So kind of what we call the Swiss model. So but you had to train that, and you got to give them the tools, and you got to rewrite the constitutions, and you got to have sunset provisions for a prime minister so that the people don't overstay their welcome and become autocrats again. That's real work, and you got to work with those teams to do that. It doesn't happen just on its own.
Daniel Levine here on Fire Breathing Rob. Again, the book is The Proof of Life, 20 Days on the Hunt for Missing Persons in the Middle East. Before we go toward the audience questions, Daniel, I want to ask, obviously we've been talking about the book, we've been talking about Syria, Libya, and this, we could talk about this for 4 hours, but to end this part of the interview and go in the audience questions, I do want to ask, what do you hope that the audience does learn from the book in general, and also learns from the conflict in Syria in general too?
Two things. First thing, I really wanted to tell the story. I want people to understand what the war looks like. In other words, how many people make so much money, and the fact that these wars just don't end as long as
Right.
some people keep on making this kind of money. In other words, you can sell people and drugs and weapons and food and clean water and medicine. If you can trade that and make these kinds of profits, the war just does not end. And that's just not just the people inside trading. That's, like I said, those are the bankers, the couriers, the lawyers, everyone involved in making it happen. You've got to stop that if you want to end these wars. Then on a more deeper personal level, what I'm trying to tell the reader is, God, once in a while, you got to appreciate what you have. There,
Wow.
but for the grace of God go I. The fact that I was lucky enough to have been born to two wonderful parents in a place that was peaceful, even in Israel in those days in 1963, and we've got the chance to grow up in Africa and in Switzerland and in the U.S. and live here now. My kids live now. My daughter graduated college. My son's in college. The idea that I can say that I don't have to worry about, my kid being picked up on the street, tortured to death in a police cell in some place in a back alley in Syria, is really that we do learn a little bit to appreciate. And I hope that a reader who's going to read the book, it's written like a thriller because it experienced it like a thriller these 20 days until they find out what actually happened to this missing person. I hope that we'll find it to be a page turner, but I want them also to walk away thinking, man, and once in a while, it's okay. I know we're complaining. We got a pandemic, and in our country right now, it feels like everyone hates the other one who doesn't believe exactly the same thing. And things can go bad in a hurry. We shouldn't take it for granted. I know it's easy for red to make fun of blue and blue to make fun of red and to hate each other, but don't take it for granted, because when it goes bad, and it's a tipping point, and it's not a light switch. You can't just turn it on again. When you have a civil war, you have a civil war, and people shouldn't forget it. Maybe look at Syria and say how fast hatred can take you to a place that you can't climb up from again.
Right, because that was a democracy at one time, like you said, when Bashar al-Assad's father was in power, correct?
Wasn't a democracy, but it wasn't what it is now. I mean,
Okay.
he ruled with an iron fist, but it was
Right.
a country, for example, where, and I'd been there, where no one asked who you are. Are you Christian? Are you Jewish? Are you Muslim? Which Muslim? People just kind of lived together. He was an autocrat, and if you
Okay.
tried to oppose him, he'd deal with you. No, this is not for the faint-hearted, but it wasn't a butchery like you have here. He was smart
Right.
enough to keep that balance. It's not my place to tell other countries what kind of political system they should have. Hey, have a
Right.
US style democracy. That's not my job. People
Agreed.
get to make that choice, and if they're not happy with it, they get to deal with that, whether democratically or not democratically. That's not my job. No one asked me. No one asked me to come and preach to people about their systems, and we shouldn't do that. But things go when it changes. Like I said, when it really goes downhill, it's like an avalanche. When an avalanche starts to get a certain size and it goes real fast, you can't just stand up and stop it. It's just going to roll you over.
Let's go into the audience question. As a person that was in the Israeli army, two things I want to hit off quick because I got a couple more audience questions. We hear a lot, and we've heard, I guess in the past maybe 3 years, we've heard a lot about the BDS movement in this country, boycott, divest from Israel. We hear this about fossil fuel companies too, but obviously in this interview, we're going to be talking about that. As a person that served, and this is obviously a personal question, as a person that served in the Israeli military, who was born in Israel, how do you take that? Because I have family members that are Jewish.
Well, I can answer your question personally. Obviously, as a
Yeah.
Jewish Israeli who served in the army there, my dad, was part of the founding generation. He was heavily wounded in the War of Independence, got his whole left side shot up, lost his left arm, was
Oh,
a war
wow.
hero, and spent his life walking around with shrapnel. He passed away 3 years ago. He literally would beep at airports when he'd walk through airport. He had that much shrapnel in his body because they couldn't, because it was so close to organs his entire life. And so, you know, I lived that conflict from one side of the conflict, but that doesn't mean I can't look at the other side of the conflict and say, man, there's a whole lot of suffering going on there too. In other words, if I just want to say that, well, I'm Jewish and, you know, I just want to kick everyone else's butt so that we can win this war, then that's fine. But then I'm not taking into account that there are other lives on the other side. You take the conflict in the Middle East, in Israel, Palestine, in that area, you know, it gets tricky. How far back do you go? Do you go back 100 years? Well, it was primarily Arab. It was Arab farmers and a few wealthy Arabs who lived there in a very small amount of Jewish families. You go back 2,000 years, it was a Jewish kingdom. Are we going to play that game, or are we going to at some point say, look, this is stupid, right? We can't keep on fighting for the next few thousand years of a few bunch of rocks in that area. At some point, we got to arrange it. My point with BDS, and the reason I oppose BDS, is not because I think people can't be critical of Israel. There's plenty of room. There's reason to be critical. I can tell you, when I was in the army, at some point I was posted in the Gaza Strip. This is before Gaza was given back to Egypt. So I was posted in there, and this, we're talking 1990, right? So I was 27 years old. And at some point I went, and I was an officer, but I went to the commanding officer of the base where I was, in the place called Jabalia, and I said, I don't want to do this. Send me to Lebanon, send me to Jordan, send me to Syria on commando units. I don't really want to be chasing 8-year-old Palestinian kids with slingshots, shooting live ammunition at them. It's just not what I want to do. And so we had tough discussions whether that's really what we want to do and whether we want to be an occupying force. There's room to be critical of Israel. My point with BDS is, who are you trying to help? BDS is also that's hurting Palestinian workers in Israeli factories in the West Bank, however you want to call it, Judea, Samaria, occupied territories, West Bank, whatever your denomination is, right? But you have to think it through. If you really want to accomplish peace in the Middle East, Israel's not going to self-deport, Israel's not going to disappear, and the Palestinians are not going to self-deport. So at some point, we have to start this dialogue with people who are interested in working on an actual solution, however that looks. 2 states, 1 state, 1 large state, but it's not going to be zero sum. And my point with BDS, it's really loud, and it's usually carried by people who don't really have a stake in it. It's real simple to be at a US college and just scream down, you know, free Palestine, Israel, Zionists are all bad. It's real easy if you're sitting in a US college. You're not the one paying the price for that. You're not the one whose family loses a job because the factory just got shut down. So when you do boycotts and sanctions, you got to think real hard. By the way, I feel the same way about sanctions against Iran or against Russia or against other countries. Think through exactly what the consequences are of your actions. And generally, I don't like the slogan, the empty slogans. There are many such examples. You know, you had a lot of Irish Catholic Americans who are really loud supporters of the IRA in the conflict.
Yeah.
And at some point you got to say, well, that's great, but it's not your kids being beaten to death or fighting in that war. So before you go and shout this stuff, why don't you think it through exactly? So it's not about being offended as an Israeli or as a Jew. You got to think this stuff through. So to me, BDS is just a slogan, like a demonstration going on the street. That's great how you feel. That's wonderful that you feel empathy for the Palestinians. That's all good. What are you going to do now? You really think BDS is going to, all it's going to do is harden even Israeli progressives. You talked about your girlfriend, someone who's progressive, who's open to negotiating, figuring out a solution. All they're going to do is circle the wagon and say, okay, you think all Jews are bad? No problem. I guess we'll stop talking to you. So think this stuff through before you just spout these slogans. That's how I feel about BDS. Sanctions in Iran just made the key generals of the Revolutionary Guards a lot richer. Because they basically controlled all the import-export business, and most of the 90 million Iranians just became poor as a result. It's not leading to regime change. You don't have that kind of leverage. Iran's about to become a nuclear power. What are you really accomplishing? Now, it may be a good tool, but you got to answer that question first. The same thing is with Israel. What are you really accomplishing? It's not changed the Israeli government's positions. I've been plenty critical of Israel in my life. I have no problem with that. I speak Arabic. I've taught at Palestinian universities. I've taught at Birzeit and Al-Quds University in Jerusalem. I have very close Palestinian friends and colleagues. My views are known. I'm not a right-wing Israeli defender. My point with BDS is you're not accomplishing anything. You're just screaming, right? And actually, it's the people on the ground who still have to figure out a solution. And you are, in fact, you go and tell the Palestinian laborer somewhere in the West Bank that his job just got shut down because the soda factory, the Israeli soda factory, had to shut down because of BDS. You go tell him that he just lost his income,
Right.
and tell me how that helps the conflict.
Well, not only that, you talked about Iran, and we're going to see the more radicalization because the U.S. pounds the sanctions. And like you said, those rich leaders will just say, well, it's the U.S. They keep pounding these sanctions down and they're screwing all the regular people, and it just leads to more radicalization. So
There
I,
is,
I agree. Go ahead.
yeah, I mean, there is a scenario where you can have sanctions against a group if
Hmm.
it can cause this group to lose power. That makes sense, right? In
Hmm.
other words, if you had a country where the regime is not that powerful, where you can really weaken them with sanctions and the demonstrations would run them over,
Right.
maybe you can consider it. But you know what happens in Iran when the people start to demonstrate because the sanctions are hitting the population? The regime has no problem firing into the crowds and killing 20,000 people. Absolutely
Yeah.
no problem. So then you really got to think this stuff through. And the other thing that happens with sanctions, and by the way, as a hostage negotiator, I see that when you put regimes in sanctions, and then, for example, an American goes missing in that country, you can't, there's no one who's going to talk to you if you're a secretary of state or someone else. They're going to say, hey, you put me in sanctions. I guess I'm the bad guy. Go find someone else to talk to. So that's the other thing you lose, is you lose the ability to continue to negotiate with that group too. So it's not about being for or against sanctions. It's just that if you're going to say I'm for sanctions, whether it's BDS or something else, think it through. Think about who the victim is, whom does it hit, and are you actually going to accomplish your goals? My point with a lot of people who demonstrate against Israel in the BDS context is you're not accomplishing your goals that way. Even if you feel very sympathetic and empathetic about the Palestinians, and by the way, I do.
Yeah.
I know that 1948, when Israel was created, was a catastrophe for the Palestinians. That's a historical fact. Anyone who doesn't agree with that is just simply denying a fact. What do we do now? Because Israel is there. Israel's not going to disappear. Jews are not going to walk back into the sea. What do we do now so that the hatred and the fighting really stops? And if you think BDS is the way to accomplish that, you're nuts, because then you just don't know what's happening on the ground.
About Netanyahu, I was told there could be a scenario that he could get back into power, that this isn't the last straw for the after the election where he got ousted.
Yeah, I mean, look, Netanyahu is a really smart political operator,
Hmm.
so and he is still the leader of the largest party, the Likud, in the country.
Hmm.
So it's totally possible that he gets back into power. The current coalition that replaced him, led by Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid, it's a very strange coalition. You have a right-wing party such as Bennett's, and you have an Islamist party in that coalition. So it looks very fragile. The thing that unites them is the dislike of Netanyahu. So it's very possible that he gets back into power. The thing that would really prevent it is not politics, it's law, because he's facing corruption trials. And if he gets convicted of a felony corruption charge, then he will be precluded from serving again as prime minister under Israeli law. But he has to be convicted, right? So that's the thing that I'm more confidence in him not being in power because of a conviction than because of an election. I think if there were an election anytime soon, it's very possible he'd be back in power. So anyone who thinks that Netanyahu's done politically hasn't been paying attention. He has been the longest serving prime minister in Israeli history, more than David Ben-Gurion also. So that's for the Netanyahu question. As to the radicalization of young Israelis, that's definitely true, and your girlfriend's impression is correct. There are a number of reasons for that. Israel was founded originally by immigration from European settlers, a lot of them coming from Eastern Europe, from after the Bolshevik Revolution with socialist ideals, founded the kibbutz movement, and that was the group that after 1967, when they were still in power with the Labour Party, started the settlement of the West Bank. This is what we call the occupied territories, the contentious area. They were the ones who founded it, not the Likud that came to power in 1977 under Begin. It was started under them, and it didn't have a religious element. But then it started to have an increase of immigration. A lot of them American religious Jews, a lot of them from Brooklyn, who started to settle in those territories, in those areas. Again, I'm not using a word, not biblical term or non-biblical term to condemn a group. I'm just describing the area. This is not a political statement, just factual history. And what happened was that they started to grow. We're talking now third, fourth generation of those settlers. These are now Israeli born and often religious families that have way more children than secular families, way more. So the average religious woman in Israel, whether it's national religious who serve in the army or ultra-Orthodox who don't serve in the army, have way more children than secular. So just demographically, in fact, the groups in Israel that are growing the fastest are the religious Jewish groups and the religious Muslim groups. And these are politically the most radicalized groups. So it's another reason why you look at Israel and say that's actually a ticking time bomb, because demographically, the most radical parts of the countries are growing, both on either side of the conflict, are growing the fastest. So her impression is definitely so. Now, there are other factors to that. Don't forget, there were the Oslo Accords and there were peace negotiations, especially the most advanced ones under Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who Labour Party, who was a former chief of staff, war hero, who offered Yasser Arafat 96, 97% of the West Bank, half of Jerusalem, with territories to be adjusted. And Arafat didn't accept the offer. I'm not going to get into it and whether it was a genuine offer or not. That's a whole separate discussion. But what happened at that moment is that a whole generation of young Israelis said, see, even when we offer basically everything since that Israel conquered in the 67 war, even when we offer that, it's not good enough. That must be evidence that the Palestinians only care about kicking all the Jews out. So you lost. I'm not debating it. I'm not justifying it. I'm not commenting on that. I'm just telling you that's what happened, right, 20 years ago. And what happened as a result of that is that basically the center of the country started to move to the right. So when she talks about this sort of gravitational pull towards more right, it's a result of both demographics, who's changing, who's having more children, but also this change over the last 20 years, this disappointment where you feel like, what's the point? Even when you offer the territories back, it's not going to get accepted.
So my question is that is the two-state solution pretty much dead now? It's over, correct?
I wouldn't say that. I mean, you always have to ask. It's like when you wish a 90-year-old happy birthday, it still beats the alternative, right? So it's kind of the same thing. It's the same thing here. We ask if the two-state solution over, well, what's it going to be? Just an occupation, and then at some point people are really going to be justified to saying it's an apartheid situation? Is it going to be a one state covering the whole territory where everyone has a vote, where Israel at some point, the Israeli Jews will be in a minority, right? Because you have a huge Palestinian population also having a lot of children. Or is it going to be a two-state solution where you separate the nations and you figure out a way to live side by side? Now, let's take a step back. There's a lot of context here. Under Trump, and whether you like Trump or not, you got to acknowledge this. What happened is one of the things he accomplished for a number of reasons, which with a lot of discussion, is the so-called Abraham Accords, the agreements between Israel and some of the Gulf monarchies, most importantly, the United Arab Emirates, others too, but mainly the United Arab Emirates, which is probably the most advanced, most intelligent, most flexible, most subtle of the Gulf monarchies, and led by the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed. And so what happened is it was a message that the Gulf states were also sending the Palestinians, which is, listen, while we understand and we empathize with your fellow Muslims and your fellow Arabs, and we understand all that, and we empathize with your plight, understand we're not going to stop from having relationships with Israel officially, because there were some informally for a long time, just because of that. So that sent a message to the Palestinians, which is, you may want to rethink your positions and who your leaders are, Hamas in the Gaza Strip in particular, in light of the fact that at some point the rest of the Arab world, not just the rest of the world, the rest of the Arab world may stop caring about this. And that's a lot of leverage they're going to lose. Now, we're not all the way there. Qatar, for example, still supports Hamas and still supports the Palestinian cause with a lot of money still also, which creates all kinds of backlash and corruption. It's all an issue. But there's a lot of stuff that's shifted there. I think that anyone who's fair-minded, unless they are willing to say, let's create one state, that whole area, doesn't matter what religion, and we'll just have a sort of a non-national, non-religious identity to that state, right? Whatever you want to call it, Israel or Palestine or some other new name. Unless that's your solution, which clearly the majority of Israelis do not want, because they do want to have a Jewish majority in their state, a state that was founded after the Holocaust and Jews being persecuted. They do want to have that majority. They want to be protected in their own country, never again, right? Should they be a minority? Unless you're advocating a one state, I don't see how you can ever say the two-state solution is dead. You have to figure out a way to decouple these two nations that really just don't like each other for historical reasons that we're not going to solve in a podcast or in any way else. They just do not like each other. It's going to require hundreds of years of living peacefully side by side before they do like each other again, right?
My thing is, and I personally believe this, you may disagree, I think the Israelis have the best spies in the world. They have one of the top two armies in the world, if, obviously between the US and Israel. I personally believe that. So, they're going, it's like David against Goliath times two. I think, in my opinion, with the Palestinians going up against Israel. Do you agree with that?
That's if you only focus on Israel and the Palestinians. It's definitely David versus Goliath. No one could argue with that, even the current conflict. But if you look at the larger region, look, why do you think the Iranians support the Syrians? It's not because they like the Syrians. They actually can't stand their guts. They think they have contempt for them. They're secular. The Assad regime is not a religious regime, even though it's Shia, it's a sect that the guys in Tehran don't like. The reason they support the Syrian regime is because they want to have a physical border with Israel that they can control, right? Why do you think they support the Hezbollah militia in Lebanon, the Shia militia there under Nasrallah? Why do they do that? Because that's the way to make mischief with Israel. And the rockets that the Lebanese militia, the Shia militia, have launching from the border with Israel could do the most unbelievable damage to Israel. Despite Israel's Iron Dome, which was fairly effective against the rockets coming from Gaza, the rockets that Hezbollah has, which are the most advanced Russian and Iranian rockets, would do the kinds of damage to Israel that would create a national calamity. Even if Israel nukes Lebanon, you're talking about the kind of calamity where you're no longer talking in terms of David versus Goliath. So it's very reckless to talk about the conflict with the Palestinians, say, well, look, we can handle it. We'll just, every once in a while there'll be a conflict with the Gaza Strip and no one's really happy and you're going to have a BDS movement in the US, but you know what? We can handle that. You can say that until it gets ugly. Remember Mike Tyson? Someone once asked him, hey, Mike, your opponent says he has a plan for how to fight you. And you know what Tyson said? He said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. And the same thing is true here. It all looks fine and real clever, and Israel has great technology, great army, great all that, spies, until it gets really ugly. And conflicts can get really ugly, and only a fool thinks that you can really control how wars can escalate. And today's war looks real different. Yesterday's Air Force is tomorrow's drones. It's a bunch of kids on computer screens with remote controls who are gamers, right? It's no longer that Air Force superiority that Israel has had since 67 and 73 and has saved Israel in many wars. It's a very different kind of warfare. It's asymmetrical. The Iranian nuclear plan is something that Israel worries about, and it's already the point of no return. Israel doesn't have a military solution to the Iranian nuclear development. By the way, neither does the US. And so you're talking in different terms here. It's no longer David Goliath. It's just everyone is going to lose in that kind of a scenario.
So then you just brought up Iran again. So talking about Iran, obviously President Obama did bring out that nuclear deal. There was good things, there was bad things. I know Netanyahu pushed against that, came to Washington, made a speech about it, regardless of that back in 2015. So, can you talk about the nuclear deal? Obviously, President Trump did away with that nuclear deal. Now Biden is thinking about probably getting back into that deal. What is your opinion on the deal in general, and how do you think President Biden would, get back in that deal? Would he have better stipulations than President Obama did?
So here's the deal. Let's just cut through all the garbage, right? Like, do you like Trump? Don't you like Trump? Do you like Obama? Don't you like Obama? Let's just for a moment take off our red or black hat, our red or blue hats, and decide red state, blue state. Let's just talk about the deal. When Obama negotiated the deal, there are two things are true, and anyone who doesn't understand that just doesn't get it. Okay, number one, it's a crappy deal. Number two, it's the only deal.
Yeah.
All right, and if you can't understand that, you don't understand politics. In politics, you say the perfect is the enemy of the good. Is the deal perfect? No, but God, it's far from perfect. Are the Iranians able to cheat and continue to enrich? Yeah, they are. But it is as close as you're going to get to slowing it down. of course, you still have sabotage in other areas that you can still do, right? Like the Stuxnet virus and all that stuff. But in terms of what it was under Obama, it was far from perfect. And yet, the entire Israeli intelligence and security establishment, without one exception, endorsed the deal. They begged Netanyahu not to fight it because they knew full well it's either this deal or no deal. And no deal means Iran's just going to continue to race towards a nuclear weapon, okay? So you got to understand, it's a crappy deal. Yeah, they can cheat. It has a sunset provision. It's a lot of stuff I wish were different, but it's the only deal. Another deal was just not on the table. That's number one. Now, if you ask me, was it right to do away with it? No, it wasn't. Now, if you ask, that's under Trump. Was it right for Biden to just want to rejoin the deal? Yes and no. I think you need to talk about it, but rejoining the old deal is almost useless at this point because the sunset provision is imminent. In other words, the limits on them being able to continue to enrich are coming up. Right. So the only way a new deal really makes sense, the so-called JCPOA, the only way it actually makes sense is if you can extend those sunset provisions. And that's where negotiation has to kick in. But now I'm not talking about big formal negotiations between presidents or secretary of states. I'm talking about what we call track 3 negotiations. Behind the scenes, what do you need? Here's what I need. Let's figure out small steps. Okay, you got this member of the Revolutionary Guard whose bank account got frozen in Switzerland or in Turkey. We'll unfreeze it, but here's what we need in return. Those are the small little steps where you get somewhere. And if you talk to Israeli intelligence, friends of mine, they'll all say the same thing, which is, we got to figure out a way to revive a deal because no matter what it is, it's better than nothing. Because nothing really means that Iran becomes North Korea, right? It becomes a rogue regime that you can't attack because they actually have nuclear weapons. And Iran is really close to getting it. So unless we're going to attack the country and invade it with millions of troops, which is not going to happen, that's the only thing that's really available.
Do you think Biden's going to get involved in that? I mean, that's partially his legacy. I was the Obama-Biden administration.
I think he is, and I think he favors the deal. He's been on record favoring the deal, and his team does, Tony Blinken and others. Right. I do also, though, believe that Biden is really a domestic president. He's really focused on domestic issues, on pandemic, on voting rights, things like that. I think that is really the core of his focus, at least for the first term, at least all the way to the midterms. After 22, who knows? But clearly the instructions given to his team, to Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, is we need to figure out a way to revive that deal. But also don't forget, there was an election in Iran. I'm using election, very loosely, that word, but the guy who won is Ibrahim Raisi, a former chief cleric, who's a hardliner. And you can argue two ways. You can argue that you need a hardliner because they're the only ones who have the guts to actually do a deal with you, because the people viewed as progressive in Iran, if they do a deal with the West, they're going to get their heads chopped off. It's the hardliner who can actually deliver it, which is many, many examples in history where that was the case. It took an Israeli hardliner, Begin, to do peace with Egypt and return the entire Sinai, a huge area, as part in 1978 as a peace agreement. Had someone on the left done that, you would have had a revolution by the right in the country. So, that can work both ways. But I'm cautiously optimistic that intelligent people also in Iran, and I'm in contact with them, that they are realizing that at some point they need an end game to this, because the country really is facing serious financial difficulties. And at some point they need a way to also climb down from their tree also. And that may be through this kind of an arrangement. I do want to say one last thing about it. When we talk about the nuclear deal, and that's great, and it's a huge threat, one of the mistakes was that conventional missiles, ballistic missiles, that other actions of the Iranians were not sufficiently included in the deal. Them supporting rogue regimes and rogue groups in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, and in Yemen, that those elements should be more included to address also the instability in the region.
You are a foreign policy wonk.
It's just my life. I've just lived this. There are others. I learn constantly from others. Absolutely not. I don't want to give the wrong impression. You got to learn, and you got to know how to listen to people. And then I, every day in the work that I do, talk to people, interact with people who know way more about this stuff than I do.
Daniel, where can they find the book? I'm sure it's on Amazon, of course. Is
everywhere books are sold. If you like Amazon or Barnes & Noble, it's there. It's in your indie bookstore, wherever you are. And if you want to, links to the book, to places you can get the book, you can also go on my author's website. I'm not on social media, but I have a website, daniellevinauthor.com, and you can find all the information there on the book and on events too.
Right. I saw the website before I came on. It looks great. Daniel Levin, thanks so much for your time. I greatly appreciate it tonight.
Rob, it's my pleasure, and say hi to your girlfriend.